Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Vayikra, the beginning of the book of Leviticus, which describes in great detail many of the offerings that we're obligated to bring at different times of the year and for different circumstances. This year, it also is Parshas Zachar, which we read during the Mafter, the section which tells us that we have to destroy the nation of Amalek for attacking us when we left Egypt. It's also the week of Purim, where we have different mitzvot which are associated with Mishloach Manos Ish L'Reyehu, to give gifts of food to your neighbor, Matanos L'Avyonim, and gifts to the poor, and of course reading the Megillah and having a feast. But I'd like to focus on the giving of the gifts to your friends and giving charity to the poor, and somehow tie this all in with what's happening also today in Ukraine. And I'll start with the Parsha. The Parsha starts with Adam ki yakrav mikem carbon. When a person brings a carbon, an offering to God. And the Talmud tells us that it doesn't say here specifically a Jew, but rather Adam, a man, any human being. And therefore we learn that any person from any nation of the world could bring an offering and it's accepted in the temple. So we see right away there's this sense of, are we just nationalistic? Are we just Jew-oriented? Are we ethnocentric? Are we only focused on ourselves and the building of our own nation? Or do we sort of have a wider net that we spread? And in a sense, from here you see that although the temple is the focus of the Jewish nation and the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and the Holy of Holies, only the Kohen Gadol, only the high priest could go. And we have many laws of coming into the temple grounds in a state of impurity. But still, we don't prescribe that only Jews could go in, or that only Jews could bring an offering. But rather, we try to include everybody. Why? Because a carbon, to bring an offering, comes from the word karav, to be close, to draw near. And everybody has an obligation to draw near to God. And as Jews, we have a responsibility to make sure that other people have that opportunity. So on the one hand, most of our holidays and a lot of what we see in the Talmud, in the Bible, sort of tells us that we should focus on the Jewish people. And that which we're going to read in Parshas Zachar, that we're supposed to destroy the nation of Amalek, sounds very nationalistic. That generations later, we still have to wipe out the nation of Amalek. On the other hand, we have other verses which tell us otherwise. And with that, I'd like to sort of perhaps talk about current events. A lot of people I've seen, heard, I've read online, have this attitude that, well, the Ukrainians were, during World War II and even before, were very anti-Semitic. Pogroms were there for many, many, many years. They were willing participants in parts of the Holocaust and helped the Nazis. And the question is, why should we now defend and worry about the Ukrainians? Well, I would have two answers to that. First of all, I've been listening to a lot of rabbis from Ukraine. There's now literally, Chabad alone has 180 different communities in Ukraine. There are tens of thousands of Jews. And as everybody knows by now, the president of Ukraine is Jewish, and he won an election with 73%. And they all say that although historically Ukraine was a difficult place, and I could say that just from my own family. My grandparents came from a town in Ukraine before World War I, and my grandmother had told me a story about how one time she was hiding. I think she said she was hiding under straw. She must have been a young girl, and I believe that was a pogrom that was happening in the early 1900s. And they didn't have it so easy back then. They were there, many Jews lived there, and life wasn't always so simple. We know that's the case. But we also know that post-World War II, and especially in the last few decades, The Ukrainians have changed. They have become more westernized in many ways. They also are welcoming to Jews. And the rabbis that I heard talking about Ukraine said they have not had any incidents of anti-Semitism. I shouldn't say they didn't have any, but there's not a lot of anti-Semitism or much anti-Semitism. I'm not claiming, and I'm not an expert in the Ukraine. I don't know what goes on in the hearts of some Ukrainians, just like I don't know what goes on in the hearts of Americans or Canadians. And we know that there's anti-Semitism throughout many countries. But as a whole, Ukraine has been a country which is welcoming to Jews and has become much more liberal and accepting of different people. And it has been a pleasant place or a decent place for Jews to live until now because of what Putin has been doing to the country of Ukraine. So on the one hand, we have this idea of Parashas Zachar, we have to wipe out the nation of Amalek, and that calls for a long discussion. How do we understand that from a moral perspective? How do we as Jews say that generations and generations, or even hundreds and hundreds of years later, we should take revenge? And there are some that say, well, Amalek really is not meant to be taken literally because there are no Amalekites anymore, and it's just sort of a symbolic notion of wiping out evil. It's a discussion that must be had. All I could say is that there are different trends within Judaism, and all you have to read is a few verses from Isaiah, and I'll read it to you. And it starts off in the second chapter of Isaiah. These are the words that Yeshayahu, Isaiah, the son of Amoz, said or prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And he said, Ba'achris hayamim, at the end of days, Nachon yiyah har beis Hashem b'rosh haharim, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above the mountains, v'nisa mikvos, and tower above the hills, v'naharu elav kol hagoyim, and all the nations shall gaze upon it with joy. V'nala al har Hashem, come, let us come up to the mountain of God, al beis Elahei Yaakov, to the house of the God of Jacob, v'yoreinu midrachav v'nelcha barachasav, that he may instruct us in his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. Ki mitzion teitzei, v'halchu amim rabim, for instruction shall come forth, and many nations will go. V'amru l'chu advar ha'Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Let's go see the words of God, the Torah, and the words of God will come out from Jerusalem. V'shafa ben hagoyim, and he will judge among the nations. V'ochiach la'amim rabim, and arbitrate for the many peoples. V'chitzu charvosam le'itim, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. V'chanitzihem lemazmaros, and their spears into pruning hooks. Lo yisa goy al goy charev, nation shall not take up sword against nation. V'lo yumdu od milchama, and they will no longer learn war. Beis Yaakov l'chu v'nelchu bar Hashem. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk by the light of the Lord. And I thought it was worthwhile to quote it at length, because really what you see here is a vision that the temple is not just a Jewish place. It's not a Jewish focus. It's not just a place for Jews to see the light of God, but rather the light of God is supposed to shine forth to all the nations of the world. And we're hoping that at the end of days, lo yilmadu od milchama, no one will learn war anymore. We want peace. And as I often quote, Bayomahu, we say in the end of Elena, Bayomahu Yehashem Echad, in that day, God will be one, Ushmo Echad, his name will be one, meaning amongst all the nations of the world. We'll all unite in worshiping God, and maybe more importantly, all unite in living moral and ethical lives, and people will be at peace. So we as Jews have to be, as it says here, walk in the light of God. In other places, we are to be an Ar Lagoyim, a light unto the nations. We have to look past the history and not to focus on revenge. We always have to be aware of the evil that surrounds us, and we have to be defensive. But we don't have to take revenge anymore. That is something which we have to work our way past and try to now come to peace with other people, just as the people of Europe seem to have come to peace with Israel. Is there no anti-Semitism in Europe? Of course there is. But just look at history and see what Germany has turned into, what the Ukraine is like, what other countries are like. Canada once had a policy of not to let any Jews in. Canada is a place where Jews are probably one of the most welcoming place for the Jewish people in the world. We have to really get past that, and we have to focus on the good that we could do. And therefore, I think it's important that now coming to Purim, and we have this obligation of giving matanos le'avyonim, gifts to the poor. We also have an obligation of lo samad al dam re'echa. We should not stand by while the blood of our friends and our neighbors are spilled. And of course, we have an obligation to all the people of the world. But there is a law in Jewish law, tzedakah, of aniyei ircha kodmin. The poor people of your city come first. That means even if there's Jews in many other far-flung places, we take care of ourselves first. You have to focus on your family, your community, and then you build out. So I think we all feel an obligation to do what we could, whatever small amount it is, that we could do to try to help the people in Ukraine. Our first step should be to help many of the Ukrainian Jews, but that doesn't mean that our charity should be limited and our outreach should be limited just to the Jews in Ukraine. But it's an important first step, and I think all of us should take upon ourselves the obligation to do our part. How much that's going to affect the outcome, I'm not sure. But it's also the idea of that it says, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazah. Every Jew is a guarantor for another Jew. And that really extends to all people. We have to feel, as it says in the beginning of Vayikra, Adam ki yakar became carbon. Everybody has the ability to bring a carbon to become close to God. And I think if we focus on that, we not only will help the Jews in Ukraine, help the people of Ukraine, but also help in a small way change the world to be a better and more peaceful place. Good Shabbos.